Hey there YouTube, I'm Ikitsu, this is Ikitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to a little bit of Age of Wonders Planetfall. So today we're going to be talking about the Syndicate with Xenoplague. Now Xenoplague I think is going to be probably just generally my least favorite of the factions, but I think that there's some interesting things you can do here that makes it a little bit better than with the Vanguard, for example. So anyway, let's start off as we usually do by looking at their doctrines. So in this particular case, once again, we're looking at biomatter preparation training being very vital to this particular strategy there. I think that you're just always going to have to take this when you're playing a Xenoplague. There's no real other way around it. Biomatter scavenging remains kind of unnecessary. The major problem that you're going to find here is that in the early game, you're looking at just the weak economic bonuses that you get for Syndicate. Nothing really sort of impressive right there. For infection experiments there, forced infection there, this can be interesting again under certain circumstances, but hopefully you're not losing so many units that you need to use it a lot. It is most useful when you're sort of like losing a lot of your own cities, I find, but realistically speaking, you don't want that happening anyway. Organic mutation research, this one's pretty powerful, plus 20% to research, but it comes again relatively late. This is one of the ones where I can definitely see uses for it, but I don't think that's a super powerful one. You're probably going to really only get indentured servitude as a major economic bonus with this sort of setup here, so you are going to rely heavily on your ability to get access to infected units there. So for military, you'll notice that I've gone down the psionic tree here for my stuff here, and I've not really bothered with any of the stuff here. Unlike with the previous one, we don't have a major incentive to go for a lot of indentured, so I don't need to have access to a lot of these tools here. Instead, we've gone for the psionic one because our primary hitter is actually going to be the enforcer in this particular case. There are other ways to play this, I think, but the other ways to play it would be things like maybe indentured spamming along with some enforcers maybe. And what you could do is you could go with the electronic tree here and just have these powerful sort of weapons be your sort of a thing that you can use there, and then you can use plague pods to gain access to your new units and play it very similarly to the way that I played it with the Vanguard. I think that sort of wastes a little bit of potential here because, like I said, I think that this is one of the worst ways to play Xenoplague. Alpha Strain Inception here, Xenoplague Parasite, you're looking at a similar situation before. This is not a very good mod. I don't think that there's been any time I think it's a great idea to use it. If you really just need to make units immune to mind influencing effect type things, Xenoplague Parasite, sure, fine, use it then. If you're up against Cynumbra, or if you're up against Celestian, use it then. But other than that, you're really just not looking at a situation where this is all that useful there. The plague pods, again, like I said, I don't think that this is a really great item. I don't like using this action unless I don't have other options there, and it's just not a great sort of use of an item slot. On the other hand, I really like the xenografted muscles, and you've got that strong melee type unit in the what are they called, the enforcers, that are capable of making really good use of this. So if you're going enforcers as your predominant means of spreading the Xenoplague, this is a powerful module that you can sort of add to those guys. They're already one of the best, if not the best, melee units in the game in terms of their punching ability. Arguably, Echo Walkers are stronger, but they're so strong that adding this to them and making that the sort of main way that you spread this is really quite potent. I think that just sort of works out really well for them. Destroyer, obviously, you're going to need those if you want to get anywhere with this faction. Xenoplague just has to have the Destroyer and the Plague Lord because they're kind of how they function, is getting those techs there so you can actually get access to these free high-tier units, which is kind of interesting, but it's just sort of, you get those things because they're free, you might as well. Regenerator's stimulation here, this is decent. There are definitely situations where I would recommend getting those. If you're up against way too many status effects, this can be very useful. If you need the healing, it can be useful. Pretty okay, but it's a little bit less necessary here just because you've got other healing options if you really want them, but all in all, it's a pretty decent one. I think that the reason I don't tend to use this one is because I think that you can just use Plague Lords for healing because they have innate healing attached to them. But yeah, if you don't have a lot of these guys running around, this can be pretty decent. On the other hand, Biospar Hyper Aggression, this is pretty powerful. Being able to add this buff to your units there, plus 25% damage is always going to be nice there. I just like adding this to the Plague Lord. He pops that in the sort of early game formation. We charge into the enemy, and hopefully I remember to refresh it as soon as I'm capable of it. But basically speaking, this is a pretty powerful buff for sort of increase the effectiveness of your entire stack there. And lastly speaking, we've got access to the Parasitic Symbiosis, which is actually a really good addition to your enforcers. It basically makes them extremely durable. They're capable of getting in towards the enemy with a whole bunch of regeneration, as well as being able to use their innate shield defensive ability. Combined together, it makes it so that they're capable of advancing on the enemy incredibly effectively without taking really any damage at all, unless they've got really good Overwatch sort of distribution. Biospore Proliferation, you don't really tend to need this, I find. Hopefully you're not losing so many units that you have to, but it's an option and it's there. I tend not to think that it's necessary. But if you are going to take it, you can. I think the Plague Lord, who already can use that ability innately, doesn't really require that you have access to that module, though. So what exactly are we looking at here? Well, we're looking at a couple interesting mods for extra hit points here that work on a couple things there. We're looking at things that really boost up your melee. The reason I don't think that you need the Parasitic Symbiosis on the ranged units is that it cuts down on their offensive potential. And when you've got a really strong gun line that can just mow the entire enemy army down at that 7-8 range, then something like the Parasitic Symbiosis really isn't going to help you that much, because it just reduces your damage output. It means the enemy's capable of firing at you. If the only defensive mod you've got on you is the Parasitic Symbiosis, your units are probably dead. But on the other hand, if you're playing melee heavy and you have other ways of getting into close quarters combat, this is a much more friendly module, because plus 15 hit points is kind of okay. But the extra regeneration layered on top of that really helps out a lot with this sort of situation. So I think that if you're going for more melee-focused units there, pretty much essential. And the reason you don't necessarily need that on things like Destroyers or Pustules, the reason I don't find you need it on those sort of guys is because those units are going to turn into Plague Lords, and those guys have that innately, so stacking that, you don't really need to. In addition to that, the Pustules and the Destroyers have skitters, so they're capable of taking a lot less damage on the approach to the enemy there. You just move them up there, and then you throw it in defense mode, and you're looking at a unit that's ridiculously difficult to hit. Because of that, you don't really need them to regenerate as badly. By contrast, the Enforcer probably going to be taking a little bit more damage. So anyway, that's my look at most of the tech tree here. It's a pretty simple tech tree, ultimately, when you're looking at this one, and there's not a ton of useful sort of stuff in it, in my opinion, but it does have things in it that you're probably going to need to look at here. So anyway, let's take a look at the specific unit that I've sort of been pumping up here as what makes this strategy interesting. So this is the Syndicate Enforcer here. As you can see, it's got a Sci-Tech Strike, a melee attack that has the high impact stagger, as all melee basically does. It's got the ability to bypass shields, it's got the ability to bypass armor. And this is what makes this such a powerful unit, in the late game in particular, because if you're up against things that have gotten a whole bunch of tech stacked on it, a bunch of modules and a bunch of things, you can be up against things that have ridiculously high amounts of armor and or shields. And the ability to completely ignore all of those defenses makes these guys incredibly powerful. Now, you are going to have to pay attention to what you're fighting against. If you're up against the Prometheans, you're pretty much going to have to use the Focus Venom. The reason is that if you're using the basic Sci-Tech Strike here, you've got yourself locked in at Psychic type damage, which does 4 less against vehicles, which is quite substantial. By contrast, if I switch it to Focus Venom, and you'll notice it's not bugged here, it's got the normal damage values. The Sci-Tech Strike still ignores armor, still ignores shields, but it's capable of dealing a different type of damage. It's going to do full damage there. Now, if you're not against Prometheans and you just don't want to pay too much attention to what your opponents are resistant to, Focus Flames is actually probably the best one, because there are not too many things out there that are natively resistant to fire type attacks there. So this is a very, very powerful module for that sort of thing there. I do think that this is going to be one of those ones where you can throw this on there and fire and forget, and if you find out that you're up against Promethean, do try to notice if you are, because this is going to tank your damage quite badly. They're quite resistant against that. Beyond that, though, you can sort of get a little bit of whatever you're thinking of getting with these guys. Now, the other thing that makes these guys special, Bone Crusher is an interesting sort of ability that they've got access to. It is a ranged attack, which means unlike with an Echo Walker strategy, these guys are capable of attacking air units. It's not the best attack, but it's actually not that weak either. It's capable of dealing a decent amount of single shot shotgun type damage there. The other nice thing about this is that it does have the cripple status effect there against certain things, capable of gimping the enemy units pretty badly, and it's also got a decent stagger chance. These combination of abilities, it makes it so that these guys are capable of getting in close to the enemy and dealing out some damage and or punching them to death really, really quickly, and also infecting things, which is sort of what you're really taking these guys for. Lastly, they've got the defense mode Psytech shield here. This is capable of giving them +4 to their shield, as well as making them 25% harder, as per standard. All defenses do that. But this brings up their stats up to 2 armor and 5 shields, which is absolutely crazy. And this is why these guys are capable of moving in on the advance against the enemy so effectively. If you give them access to the Parasitic Symbiosis, put them in Psytech shield stance on the way towards them, these guys are going to be able to take a lot of damage without having to take too many defensive modules, which is really, really nice. This setup here is going to give you a lot of melee damage. Gives you the ability to parasitically infect the enemy there. It's capable of applying burning, is capable of using their range attack against air units for a decent amount of damage there. They've got lots of stagger potential. This thing is capable of doing massive impact, so even stagger resistant units get staggered by these guys. The Psytech shield lets them advance, and their regeneration makes it so that they're practically invulnerable on that advance unless you can kill them in one go, which is going to be hard through that Psytech shield there. So basically the only weakness to these guys is that they're not particularly resistant against stagger. They are resistant, they're just not immune, which is kind of what you would want ideally. Let's go ahead and unequip all this stuff here. So yeah, this is kind of, I think, what makes this combination a little bit special. It's that they're capable of getting that sort of parasitic infection through a powerful melee unit instead of having to rely on those really sort of not that great grenades. So let's take a look at some of our stacks here. Now, you're going to notice that I have got plenty of other units. That's just sort of typical for this game. Over here, we got access to a couple of these Plague Lords, and you'll see that I've given these guys these Xenografted Muscles and the Psytech Vision Enhancers. Now, I do want to actually switch some of these out eventually, but ultimately, this is pretty much okay. The Xenografted Muscles and the Vision Enhancers were applied when these guys were the Destroyers or Pustules, and the reason is that they're fairly cheap mods. They're relatively inexpensive, meaning that I can get them on there for cheap. And they'll be useful through those 2 phases. Once they are Plague Lords, I don't really need those modules anymore, and I could really do to replace it with something like the Exploitative Targeting System. This one you can keep, but I could also replace it with, say, the Biospore Purification if I really wanted to go full supporty with this guy. Parasitic Symbiosis, as I already mentioned, doesn't really stack with what's already got there, but you can do some other things that are slightly different with this. But basically speaking, you don't really need to do anything too fancy with these guys. They're pretty much capable of looking after themselves with their base stats and abilities. The reason that I go for the Psytech Vision Enhancer in anything, the 10% accuracy is pretty okay, but it's a tier 1 mod that gives you +2 shields. Normally tier 1 mod only gives you 1 shield. So applying the Psytech Vision Enhancers to a bunch of stuff is very cost efficient if you want that extra 2 shield points. And extra 10% accuracy is surprisingly decent. So that's why I've given it those sort of 2. Now, the only one that is actually specifically for the Plague Lords, and I really want to make sure they have, is the Biospore Hyperaggression, because this is going to be a central figure to the army, and this is going to be a sort of supporty type thing in a lot of situations. Basically, since you're going to have units sort of clustering in and around it, and moving sort of beside it and moving away from it, so that you can make best use of its natural regenerative capabilities there, the Biospore Hyperaggression becomes quite useful in that context. So you're definitely going to want to take advantage of that if you're capable of it. And since it's a free action, it's pretty easy to apply to a bunch of these guys for free. Plus 15 hit points also makes these guys a decent amount extra tanky. Not great since they already have a high base hit point pool, so armor or shields would be a little bit better, but that's where the Psytech Vision Enhancers comes in nice. Next up, we got access again to our Enforcers, and again, exactly what I said we were going to put on there: Xenografted Muscles, the Focus Flames, Parasitic Symbiosis. You'd think that you could just use the the Plague Lords to get access to the same sort of effect there as an aura. The reason that you want these guys to have the ability to have it on their own is that you're very vulnerable on the approach if you don't spread out your units in a lot of situations. Having these guys all have their own parasitic symbiosis really does help in the late game in keeping these guys all healthy and alive when they're approaching their opponents there. For our standard indentured, we were really just going for the exploitative targeting system and the Syndicate vision enhancers. We're not really looking to upgrade these guys too heavily. If I wanted to add anything to these guys, it would probably be something like Biospore Purification, just to give them an extra ability if they needed to, since I don't really care about their actions all that much. Their offensive capability is okay, but it's not really the crux of what we're doing as offense, so giving them a support ability could be potentially a little bit useful there. There we are. For our Overseer, I've added on the Mantra of Clarity. This makes it so that our hits apply a debuff for 20% extra to hit. This makes it so that I can use these guys on the attack to give markings to make things easier to hit. I only have my starting Overseer. I did not bother building more of them. The reason that this is a fairly decent mod on these guys is because I'm not going to be using them to support the indentured quite as often as I would normally, so they're going to have to attack a bit more. Giving them the Mantra of Clarity lets them do that while being supportive. The Syndicate vision enhancers also sort of helps with that by giving them that extra shielding, as well as being a decent sort of ability to hit the enemy a little bit easier. If I wanted to add another one, I'd throw it on the exploitative targeting system, just to make this so that they're really, really accurate there, but not really that important. They're not sort of the key to what we're doing here. Same thing for the Guild Assassins there. They're a pretty high damage unit, but honestly speaking, I don't think that they're going to be super, super important, so this is just what we had from a starting one there. And we just went for a very economical build there. Now, our other sort of armies running around here are very, very sort of similar there. We're looking at just stacks and stacks and stacks of enforcers wherever we get the chance to. And they sort of pop out pustules and stuff like that pretty effectively. They're really quite decent at that. And don't be afraid of just filling out your armies with whatever else you happen to be able to get your hands on. That always is a good idea in this game. So we've got a bunch of stacks of just random Amazons that we've been able to get out of here. We could, of course, go for more advanced Lancers that are capable of doing the Xenographic Muscle thing. This is actually quite powerful and quite decent on these guys here, but I don't know that I necessarily feel like we need it. I just needed units on the field in large numbers. So yeah, that's kind of my look at the Xenoplague with Syndicate. I think that this is an okay combination. There's some fun and interesting things, but the fact that it's sort of narrow in terms of what Xenoplague can do, even in this case, is kind of why I think that Xenoplague is not necessarily the most interesting of the factions there, but more importantly, I think that this is going to be one of the ones where it's fun to do a run using something like this, maybe doing something like trying to challenge yourself and going the same sort of route as the Vanguard with Xenoplague by going for indentured with grenades. But ultimately speaking, I think that you're going to get tired of this pretty quickly. I think that's not necessarily the strongest thing out there either, but I think that it is still worth a try. So I would recommend that anyone out there give this a go once and, you know, have your fun with it, and then sort of probably move on to something a bit more interesting with a bit more variety to it. If it really, really speaks to you, then of course go nuts, but I think that this is one of the ones where you could definitely do better. So anyway, I hope you found this episode enjoyable, and of course, as always, hope to see you guys all next time.